All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we bring back my good friend Ralph Hancock, professor of political philosophy at Brigham Young University. Ralph, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
We're going to talk about something that is rather deep, rather important, and very pervasive, I think, in our current political and church environment, and that is political neutrality. The church earlier this year came out with a statement on how it is positioned in most cases to be politically neutral. I want to talk about that stance, what that means. What does it mean to members of the church? And are we supposed to reflect that? And what do others do as compared to the church, other Christian organizations? What are they doing in the United States? I want to start with this. You made a comment in a recent article, or a portion of your article here, that was out in Public Square magazine and Meridian magazine, called Pragmatic Political Priorities, Faith Within a Culture Clash. And you stated this: if we want to help make our world better, or at least help prevent it from becoming much worse, then we must care about the laws, policies, and shared purposes that drive political life. Do politics matter? I mean, we get so many talking points recently about, and I agree with them oftentimes, about don't let your politics move above your worship, above your testimony, etc. How much do politics matter?
All right. Well, an excellent, not an easy, but an excellent question to start with. I think these two truths have to be kept in view and held together. On the one hand, one can be too political, too rabidly political. One can be consumed by political concerns as if they were ultimate concerns, as if our religious devotion were swallowed up in political activism. That's obviously a risk, and it's a risk that can affect both sides or both ends of the political spectrum, let's say. On the other hand, it's also true that we're surrounded by politics. We are drenched in politics. We are swimming in a political sea. That politics frames politics, and you'll see that I'm using politics in a very broad sense. You'll notice in the Church's neutrality statement, it's mainly focused on electoral politics and taking sides in who should win or whom you should vote for and so forth. But when I address politics, I'm taking a step back to see that, in a sense, politics frames, or is always, let's say, pressing to frame our ideas, our morality, our thoughts about ultimate things, a good life, a good person, etc. So that's when I talk about politics, I'm a teacher of the tradition of political philosophy, and including Aristotle notably. And so I think Aristotle is right that human beings are, in a sense, he says, political animals. That doesn't mean that all of us are hungry to get elected or to have power. It means that we depend upon and find our being in authoritative communities, authoritative political communities. And everything we do is shaped by the moral authority of our most authoritative, decisive community. So that's the frame I'm in when I talk about politics. And in that sense, to be neutral about politics would be not to care about the very framework of your life or that of your neighbors and people you love, not to care about the future of your family, your children and your grandchildren, because politics is going to affect all that.
Why do you think it is? There was a poll that was put out recently showing that, for example, Utah had one of the lowest participation rates in voting in the country. Why are Latter-day Saints not, as in, you'd think that they would be involved? They used to be much more involved in politics. Those numbers have changed pretty dramatically over the last 25 years. Why would members not, are members more neutral politically now than they used to be, do you think? Or why at least aren't they as engaged as they used to be?
I think there's a temptation to withdraw, and it's very understandable. I mean, all of us want to like shut out the noise sometimes, and we all complain about the polarization and incivility, and we hear our church leaders warning us against extremism and incivility. So there are all kinds of reasons to want to withdraw. But I think that there's also an element of complacency. Frankly, we've all been a little spoiled in our liberal democratic country, where our freedoms have been pretty well protected, and we've been prosperous, and we've had the luxury of ignoring politics when we felt like doing so. But there's no guarantee things will stay that way. And I think Latter-day Saints and citizens of Utah in general have tended to be a little complacent and wishfully thinking that we can avoid the noise and avoid the like emotional upheavals and the emotional stress, and that maybe like the political world will leave us alone and just kind of go away. It won't matter, but I think it will.
So in a more and more politicized world, there is the danger of putting politics above religion. But where is the intersection between those two? It used to be, for example, Ruff, it used to be when I was much younger, I used to look at the Book of Mormon as purely just a spiritual book, and that's primarily what it is. But it's actually a very political book. And I think to myself, well, how much does my religion and my belief system, how shouldn't I be expressing that in my vote? Shouldn't I be expressing that in my involvement with the community and politics? Or is that something that needs to somehow be separated?
Well, the separation can never be complete. Look, we are, the political sea that we're swimming in is a sea of liberal democracy, in which the idea of a limited government and a kind of rough separation between religion and politics. There's never a pure separation, but a kind of rough separation between religion and politics has been fairly successful. And so in that sense, we've been spoiled, and we haven't even noticed the value and maybe the fragility of the protections under which we live. And I don't mean just the explicit constitutional protections. I mean the more or less hospitable moral and political environment. But now to come right to in a way, the philosophical dimension of your question, politics and religion intersect necessarily because they both have to do with morality. Morality is fundamental to both. Morality, the rules of life, an understanding of what makes a good person, what makes a good community, how we should live. These are at stake both in our political life and in our religious life. And I'm not arguing at all that they should be fused, but the intersection is inevitable, and the mutual influence between religion and politics is inevitable. And I would even say that there's some necessary transmission, or you could say leakage, of fundamental beliefs, understandings of the good from both directions. And that's why we need to be very attentive. Now, you and I, as Latter-day Saints, we know what our ultimate perspective is. It's the one framed by the restoration and the plan of salvation and our covenants and our idea of the ultimate good, which is a kind of familial exaltation. That's what we consider ultimate. But the political world generates its own understanding of what makes a good human being and what a good human life consists in. And so the work of keeping these two in some kind of alignment, however imperfect, or adjusting the two views so that they can fit together in some workable fashion. I mean, our ultimate religious beliefs and the morality that seeps, you might say, from our political views, that task is ongoing. But I think religion must be our priority, but if we ignore the interface, the intersection between religion and politics, you know what's going to happen? It's not going to go away. The politics is going to seep into and determine our religion, even when we think we're being apolitical, or at most, even more when we think we're being apolitical.
Yeah, and that's, of course, I cover a lot of that on the podcast. That is definitely happening. And a lot of that is because there's not, I don't know if I want to call it always political, but certainly involvement in supporting the gospel and its principles and those that would go along with liberty, et cetera. What about, Ralph, what about the culture war? All right, we've got a polarity now in the U.S. that is, you know, it's always existed, but it ebbs and flows. But we're in a position now where it's pretty strong because there are so many radical changes right now that we're going through. You had the 60s and 70s where we moved quite a bit to the left and culture was disrupted. This makes that look like child's play to me right now with what's happening in our worldview, even going down to the point of our worldview, of our philosophical view here as members of the United States, as citizens of the United States. This is changing very, very quickly. And so there's this culture war that has developed, I would say, certainly nothing that I've had in my lifetime, where it can be a complete distraction from the gospel. And at the same time, how can you not look at this and say, I have a responsibility, not just for me, but for my family, for my neighbors, for my community, for my church, to be involved and to fight for the principles and the worldview that we see through the gospel.
Well, I agree with that perspective. And I would even say that at the most fundamental level, the reason we need to be aware of, at least, and I would even say engaged in, at least insofar as an intellectual and spiritual engagement with the culture wars, because if we're not, we're invaded by the side that is winning the cultural wars, at least among elites in the West. We're invaded by that side, whether we know it or not. So I know it's increasingly unfashionable to talk about the culture wars. First of all, ordinary people just want to seek peace, and we're a little complacent. We'd rather avoid it. But lots of intellectuals now try to, and political scientists want to poo-poo the idea because, well, frankly, because they don't want us to resist the side that is winning. So people who talk the language of culture wars, like us, are often accused of being immoderate or wanting to stir things up or exaggerating differences and so forth. I don't think so. I think that the culture war is a fact that stares us in the face. I mean, in the article you mentioned in Public Square and Meridian, I reference a friend and fellow political philosopher, Scott Yenor, who describes us as living under a new sexual regime, a new sexual constitution. That's very different from the one that held sway. That was part of the air we breathed when you and I were growing up. Well, I grew up, I don't know how many years before you, but anyway, in the olden days. So to ignore that now, to ignore that we're effectively living in a new sexual regime is not to see how we are being influenced.
Well, and it's saying sorry, it's again, the problem, this is kind of like, to use a term from the left, it's like we have American privilege. We have freedom privilege. And that freedom, if you grab onto it and you live good principles, you're going to produce good consequences in a good environment. And so as you do that, and others then want to attack what you have and your way of life and want to change everything, you automatically, I think by default, at least, you're in a position of complacency because things are good. And they're good only because you're sitting on the bedrock of certain principles from the founding of America and liberal democracy and freedom of religion, where all of these things are coming, line by line, precept upon precept, are being eroded.
Drip, drop, drip, drop.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's how they're, and I think what people don't realize, to me, as I see this, and I've watched this train steam on by, there has to be a tipping point somewhere. At some point, there's going to be a tipping point where there may not be a turning back.
Yeah, well, who can say how close we are to this tipping point or threshold, or whether we've passed it? I think we have to take responsibility for changing and resisting where we can. But on the point of complacency, I was going to say there's even a more insidious dimension of the complacency than the one that you brought out about our being accustomed to living under relative freedom and prosperity. But here's the thing: the regime changes, like the proverbial what is it? A frog in the boiling water. And we don't want to notice that how much has changed. And you look at, that's why I think the example cited by Scott Yenor in my article it's so important to come to terms with. Because if you look around us, it's undeniable that we're living under a different regime, a different authority, a different set of ideas that hold sway and that define what is permissible to not only to say, but to think. So the really insidious side of this complacency is that we don't even dare think some things, like some lifestyles are right and some are just wrong, much less say them. We don't even dare think such things. So far have we been influenced by the authority of the regime determined by the increasingly winning side of the culture war.
Yeah, and again, how has that happened? How did that authority take over? You have a hard left movement that in the early 20th century, throughout going even pushing through the late 20th century, this was done by force. This was done by rifles and tanks and coups. And here you have more of a cultural coup that has happened as these ideas of identitarianism and certain tenets of leftism that have completely taken over the institutions in the United States.
Yeah, that's a story. I mean, you're comparing the the establishment of hard and explicit totalitarianism in certain regimes like the Soviet Union and Communist China and others. But we have a more subtle and possibly even more insidious version of a kind of totalism that has sort of crept over our way of life and our institutions, roughly think since the 60s. Like baby boomers like me were easily accused of assuming that things that happened when we were young are the most important things. But I'm going to unapologetically say things started happening in the late 60s and 70s. There was a turning point where a kind of radicalism got a foothold in the mainstream. And, we could try to trace some of this history back to 1968 and the radicalism in the streets, the takeover of the Democratic Party, the changing of the rules of the Democratic Party. But a new left became ensconced within the Democratic Party, and its influence has grown. And many of the radicals have become, many of the kids radicalized in the streets and invading university administration buildings are now the professors that are my age or older, or not. Now we've had time for them to teach another generation of professors who takes that radicalism for granted. So our elite institutions, starting with universities, but including law schools and the legal profession and media, and now we have even like corporations, businesses, which were supposed to be, in a way, the check against impractical radical nonsense. The largest corporations are happy to take on the apparatus of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all the expense that involves, because they can afford it, and the smaller businesses can't. So it helps to secure their positions. But anyway, this has been a process of the march from the institutions is the neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist formulation. But how can you say it hasn't happened? How can you say it when you look around and see what is considered respectable or authoritative, what is considered correct thinking these days has been very much influenced by what was the province of a radical few when I was a youth.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You hear pushback sometimes from individuals like saying, "Come on, this is too much. What you're saying is too much." Almost like, don't get involved, right? You don't need to speak up. This is not as bad as you think it is, and certainly we don't want to talk about some doomsday issues here, but it's I think your question there of saying how can you deny any of this is a very good one. I mean, look around you. What major institution in the United States is not run by leftism?
Yeah.
Now, it used to be that you had business that at least was, because you didn't, and again, I trace this all back through academia, and so you don't have that as much coming out of the humanities, and you've got business, which is about enterprise and capitalism, and then all of a sudden you have Occupy Wall Street that happens almost 15 years ago now, and so you look at the change that has happened in those 13 to 15 years in Wall Street. It is no longer the Chamber of Commerce, along with the Fortune 500, that are even the country club Republicans, so to speak, and are bastions of capitalism, and these are now becoming the exact opposite. When you look at the major investment banks that are involved with these companies, what they are pushing, what they're requiring with the shareholders, what they the internalizing of DEI in each of these companies, business then. You've got family. Look at how our families have changed and the things that we are walking on eggshells with. You've got the media completely. That's social media completely. I mean, you go back, anybody who's looked at any of the Twitter files that was put out by Barry Weiss and Matt Taibbi, it's incredible the involvement that the government on one side and the FBI have with social media companies. Whether you're looking at Hollywood or the news media, for the most part, it's all run by one side. Law is not as bad, but it's definitely leans harder to the left, and you have a number of leftists getting involved there in bigger and more powerful positions. It's like every major institution has changed dramatically,
right?
Especially in the last 15 years.
Yeah, and let me come back to the most primary and unavoidable evidence of the regime, the final authority that we're under, because it's useful and illuminating to trace historically the march through the institutions, beginning, if you will, especially in the late 60s. It's worthwhile to study each of our institutions and analyze how power works through those institutions. But I would invite the listener, the viewer, just to do the simple exercise of imagining what you can say and not in public without fear of being shamed, discredited, or even being harmed materially. I mean, talk to young people in the workforce, especially in large corporations that are part of the global economy, but not only in the larger enterprises. But talk to young people and ask them, what are you free to talk about and what not? And if they're really introspective, they've already been shaped to know what things are permissible to say. And sometimes the sanction might be just informal, you'll be looked down on, but we're talking about people's associations and their livelihoods here. It's to deny the fact that our thinking is constrained by a new elite that has been decisively shaped by what was considered extremism and radicalism just a few decades ago. I think to deny that is impossible if you just look at the facts that are staring you in the face.
One more add-on to that
Yeah.
you don't need to address if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But you bring that all the way into, say, a subsidiary of the church like BYU, and you see this happening regularly. We cover this a lot on this podcast.
Yeah.
I know many professors that have had to be quiet, that are afraid to speak up for that very reason. They're afraid to be yelled at. A lot of them are afraid of their jobs. I don't think their job is at issue, but they think it's at issue. And they worry about tenure. They worry about promotion. I know a couple of professors specifically that have been turned down for tenure because of their political stances, and many that have been forced out because of their political stances. And so we're not immune to this, and people need to realize, yes, we're speaking of this as about the United States, but as Latter-day Saints and the church and our culture, we are not immune to this. This is happening on a regular basis. It is also, as an institution, creeping into the church.
Yeah, well, it's unmistakable. It's inevitable that this new regime of authority, which has so thoroughly captured at least the critical mass of elites in the United States, it's inevitable that this affects BYU. BYU is part of the larger academic enterprise. Brigham Young University, especially in Provo, there are certain reasons why BYU Idaho is slightly more insulated from some of these pressures. That would be another question that I'm a little less familiar with. But how can you deny that BYU, Brigham Young University in Provo, which seeks to be to operate as an elite academic institution and to prepare extremely able students for participation with other national and global elites in society and economy and media, law, what have you? How can you deny that we're part of this system and we're affected by it? The peers who peer review us are are parts of this establishment that we are talking about. The graduate schools from which we hire faculty and the journals that publish our research are largely part of this establishment. Now, it's not an absolute monolith, but we're talking about broad and powerful tendencies that shape basic habits of thought and patterns of behavior. So yes, obviously, look, if I wanted to be hired at BYU, if I were 30 years old and wanted to be hired at BYU, I couldn't be on this show talking with you.
Yes, that's right. I understand that. Yeah, because of what you're saying. Yeah. So Ralph, what can BYU do about this? I mean, BYU is in a position where, as you said, it wants to be an elite university. It's part of the Big 12 now. There's a lot that comes along with that. I've already seen several results from this. Can BYU do anything to carve itself out from the rest of academia?
Now that's an interesting question, and interesting you mentioned the Big 12. I'm not competent to pursue that further, but it's an example of us being ingrained in existing institutions. So I'll make a suggestion that we could come back to another time, but will we be better off if BYU keeps losing in the Big 12? That is in the sense of not envisioning our identity so much as part of this large institutional thing called the Big 12. I like to win. I'd rather not lose, but the question does occur to me. But in terms of BYU and its larger academic host, you might say, the environment, the larger academic enterprise in which we operate, you might say we live and breathe and have our being. I would say it's very hard to be a distinctive institution. It means going against the grain and knowing you're going against the grain in every decision, in every policy, in every point of institutional design all the time, because it's like, like rowing upriver. It's not going to happen by accident. Who was it? Some conservative pundit or conservative leader decades ago said something quite true. He said, any institution that is not explicitly, deliberately, intentionally conservative will be liberal, progressive. I would add now, woke. That's the drift. That's where things go. It's not enough say not to enthusiastically and deliberately embrace the drift. You will drift. You will go with the flow, which is a very powerful flow. It's like whitewater. It's not just a calm, lazy river. You will go with the whitewater flow. So the only way to be an alternative is deliberately to go against the prevailing tendencies. And that's difficult. That's unpopular, especially when we've hired a faculty and largely an administration for decades on other principles, on the principles of integrating as far as possible with the academic elite as a whole.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, BYU is going along with the whitewater more than not going along. It's not like they're swimming upstream.
Yeah.
If they are, they're barely swimming upstream.
Or they're slowing down. They're not.
Yeah.
They're just putting in their oars to not go quite as fast.
Yeah,
as others
they're
might be
moving up,
going.
but they're swimming. They've got their oars going upstream just slightly, but they're still moving backwards.
No, I don't disagree, but let's give credit to a new body of leadership from Elder Holland, who's no longer on the board, but he's made great contributions in some speeches that weren't popular with faculty, to Elder Clark Gilbert, the Commissioner of Education, and the new administration, Shane Reese, and his very articulate and I think well understanding academic vice president, Justin Collins. All these people have announced in unmistakable terms that they want to row upstream. I wish them well. It's not going to be easy. It's impossible to overestimate the task of how many oars we need in the water and how hard they need to row. So I still don't. We're still hopeful that we can row upstream by persuasion and exhortation. I don't see that happening. There's too many vested interests, and these interests are not just like financial, like having a salary or getting a raise. They are deeply social, psychological, you could say spiritual, in the sense that they relate to fundamental worldview. We have embraced a worldview, or an intersection of worldviews, a way of intersecting our worldview, Latter-day Saint worldview, with that of the larger, increasingly ruling elite. And to extricate us from that is not just materially threatening, it's psychologically and spiritually a crisis.
Well, it's a crisis, and I will say to anyone involved with BYU listening to this and agreeing with this, you have to put your oar in. People need to realize this. We are such a button down, polite, niceness type of a culture. And you got to realize that's great when things are going well. But if you are going downstream, you better put your oar in and start going upstream a little bit. And if people don't do that in enough numbers, you can have as many people as you want at the top. They're not going to get rid of all of these individuals. They're not going to go do some mass firing at BYU. This requires people to stand up and say something. This requires people to put their oars in and start swimming upstream and rowing upstream. You can't, as I said, you can't just participate in the spiral of silence. It will roll you over. It'll steamroll you if you're not careful.
Yeah, you've mentioned a spiral of silence. I think of the eloquent phrase from Solzhenitsyn that has been quoted by friends such as Rod Dreher and Daniel J. Mahoney: "Live not by lies." To the degree that we silently accept or assent to a regime that is finally incompatible with some fundamentals of the gospel, we are reinforcing the lie. We are contributing to the spiral of silence, or we're actually contributing energy to the whitewater, you might say, that we've been talking about here.
That's a good point. All right, I want to go back to the church here for a second, because your article that you wrote, you give two different views on things. One is from the church, and I just want to read a short portion of this from their statement on neutrality here. The work of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints includes sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, strengthening individuals and families, and caring for those in need. The church does not seek to elect government officials, support or oppose political parties, or generally take sides in global conflicts. Generally is an important word there. The church is neutral in matters of politics within or between the worlds many nations, lands, and peoples. Okay, opposite of this here is what you have, the Manhattan Declaration that comes from 2009 of several Christian organizations that got together and put this together. Here's an excerpt from this. It says, freedom of religion and the rights of conscience are gravely jeopardized by those who would use the instruments of coercion to compel persons of faith to compromise their deepest convictions. We affirm marriage as a conjugal union of man and woman ordained by God, that sounds very familiar, from the creation and historically understood by believers and non-believers alike to be the most basic institution of society. Okay, so we have a proclamation on this that sounds very similar to that, put in 1995, 14 years before the Manhattan Declaration here is put out by these other Christian organizations. And interestingly, and I may have to insert this, but at the bottom paragraph of that proclamation on the family, it states that we are expected to be involved politically with supporting the principles of the family, right? It is almost a call. It is not a neutrality on those principles of the family.
No, not at all neutral. In fact, I've memorized this statement. No, I'm cheating. I actually, I'm not so good at memorization. I called it up further from the LDS Family Proclamation. What was the date on that again?
1995.
Seems like yesterday to me, but that's me. Further, we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets. How's that for neutrality? We call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family as the fundamental unit of society. That's
not very neutral.
Every bit as robust as the Manhattan Declaration. And so, I mean, it leaves with this. This has not been rescinded. And of course, in the last, it was just in the last General Conference, wasn't it? Was it?
Yes.
President Oaks or someone else who essentially
President
said.
Oaks, President Nelson, and President Elder Christofferson also.
All three said this is not going away, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to lay this beside the neutrality statement, and it arguably creates a bit of a head scratcher. How do you put these two together? That was really the occasion for writing my article. How are we to think about this, what I call a pragmatic stance on neutrality in relation to this clarion call to stand up for the family, and a warning that not to do so risks a disaster, a calamity, the calamity foretold by ancient and modern prophets. Well, that's that sets to us a problem that I think is worth considering. That's why I wrote the article. But what we have to see then, I think the pragmatism of so-called neutrality has to be understood against the background of this fundamental position. Okay, it certainly can't be deduced. One cannot be deduced from the other. But you have to, I think the fundamental truth of the Family Proclamation has to be held in the background when we talk about neutrality. And then we hear all of the qualifications, like you just read one, in general. But there's always the qualification in cases of very significant moral issues. The church reserves the right, etc. Those are all qualifications. So what I'm hearing is that for now, the church leadership has judged wise to keep our heads low, to not pick fights that we can't win, or maybe that we've already lost. And even while there may be real, this is my extrapolation or interpolation of what's going on between the lines. I offer it for what it's worth. But even though we may feel our freedoms constricting we may worry that we're not as free as we were even a short time ago. Still, we have a freedom to build temples and to do temple work, and maybe especially against the horizon of what seems to be a fairly short time perspective in terms of how much time we have to work with in this phase of our existence on Earth. The millennial question that I evoke at the beginning of my article. In view of all that, let's pragmatically lay low as far as possible for now, do the work of the temples, and also not let these cultural divisions tear up our congregations, but try to keep peace so that we can make progress on the most fundamental points. That's my effort to make sense of the pragmatic strategy that the church seems to be leading with at this moment.
So, and fine, that,
Yeah.
who am I to say that's right or that's wrong? I can see issues there.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean, even if we say that's the right approach, that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for letting all of this virus, quite frankly, coming in, especially into the church. I mean, Ralph, I just had another one today. I get this almost every day. Someone tells me about an incident in primary. Today was primary, and young women's and young men's at fast and testimony meeting and Sunday school, where there is this movement to make Jesus something different, a political Messiah. There is a push against the proclamation on the family, right? Everything you would think of that this virus brings in is being done on a regular basis already in the church in the United States. And so how long do you say, well, we're not going to create a conflict? Because it's not just external. It's not just a matter of, well, we want to make sure that the government doesn't affect us. Yeah. That to me is secondary. Exactly. I think that is a secondary threat. It's a big one, but it's a secondary threat. The primary threat is that virus entering inside. Exactly. And that's not doing anything because we don't want to create a conflict.
You've come to the key point, Greg, because the real point is the culture war in our souls and in the congregations. The real question is not whether we win or lose in terms of the constellation of forces in America or in Western liberal democracies or what have you. The question is who wins in our souls and in our congregations. And this points up exactly what I was saying earlier. There's a very strong tendency for those categories that prevail in the larger society and that we assent to, even on just pragmatic grounds. There's a very strong tendency for those categories to seep into the way we think, even in the religious frame and in our congregations. And often when we think we're being not political or politically neutral or leaving politics alone, that can be the moment when we're most political. I mean, you will hear people say in Sunday school or Priesthood Relief Society, let's not be political, or let's not be involved in the culture wars. Let's just accept everyone just as they are and not be judgmental. That is massively political. That is taking the categories of relativistic tolerance, I would say, from the larger society and applying it to our religion and to the very terms and foundations of our religious communities. So let me link this back to the theme of the culture war, because if someone were to argue, Ralph, Greg, the reason we're not talking that way anymore is that we've lost. Well, at least that would be a sober assessment that would have a lot of truth to it. And I have two answers to that. One, we can keep losing. There is more to lose. And notice how it was that like 3 days or 3 minutes after the Obergefell decision that nationalized gay marriage, then this trans movement emerges, where it somehow becomes becoming the latest expression of liberation to mutilate children in the name of the rights of transsexuality. So that's we can keep losing. We can keep losing in the political realm, but even more importantly, if we accept the categories imposed upon us by the new elite regime under which we have lost, then that's an internal disaster. Then the foundation of our beliefs is dissolved in this relativism or wokeism, this phony relativism, which is really a dogmatic wokeism. So I say, if we've lost, say it. Say we've lost, and it's a disaster. I mean, just to come back to the language of the Family Proclamation, that foretells calamities that would come about by the disintegration of the family. We've lost, and it's a disaster. And maybe can we turn things around and win again, or can we stop losing? Well, very important practical question.
Yeah, I would splice it and say,
yeah,
we've lost, and it will be a disaster.
Yeah, exactly. But as soon as we admit the cost of the lost, of present and future, then we're in the wholesome frame of mind where we're not letting ourselves be invaded by the winning worldview.
Yeah. Well, you bring up, along with that, the idea of neutrality. You bring up two words that we hear a lot that go along with it, that you seem to pull in as being comparable to the idea of neutrality, and that is fairness and tolerance, right? Those to me are two very negative words. And obviously, at least from an individual standpoint, I'm not going to say this about the church. They're an institution. Maybe they have a different view on this from an institutional perch. But if you're comparing neutrality to fairness and to tolerance, neutrality is not neutral. It can't be neutral. There is no neutrality. Neutrality means loss.
Yeah. Well, you could try out the statements, fairness isn't fair and tolerance isn't tolerant, and there would be truth in both of those. I think the stance of fairness is strictly consonant with the pragmatic strategy of neutrality. Let's win what we can under the language of fairness. Fairness for all in Utah politics, proposed as a model for the nation, basically says, all right, if we can promise the homosexual community equal rights in housing and employment, it's things like that are at stake, isn't it? If we can be fair to them, then we'll ask them to be fair to us in terms of protecting our right to hold our beliefs about the eternal family and our temple practices and covenants and so forth, and then everything will be fair. Well, that's a if that negotiation works or holds some ground for however long it holds, then and I'm not the political strategist for the church. I don't know all the forces in play. I don't have a feel for that, but that works as far as it works. It's not a stable religious or philosophical foundation, because everyone's going to define fairness in terms of what they think is ultimately important, in terms of what they think makes a good person and a good community. If you believe that a good person is one who is liberated from all sexual hangups and who would never judge anybody because of their sexual practices, then fairness, what you mean by fairness, is deeply colored by that. So the idea, fairness, even tolerance, help us maybe to make some common ground, but it's temporary, it's shifting. I mean, Elder Packer as I cite in my article, and as President Oakes cites in his speech or article on truth and tolerance, Elder Packer says, tolerance is a very unstable virtue. I would say the same of fairness, of neutrality. They're all unstable because they can't name their own foundations. They can't.
There's no stance.
They can't explain the purposes behind their stance.
Ralph, are those even virtues then? Is really neutrality a virtue?
Neutrality is kind of it's hard to. But let's talk about tolerance, because that's a little more full-bodied, a little better candidate to be a virtue. And I would commend to people President Oakes' talk on truth and tolerance. I'm forgetting now where it originated, but it's appeared in more than one form. But yeah, he does a good job of showing the partial truth or degrees of truth in tolerance as well as truth, because it is true that we need to not be excessively confident that we know every point of the truth or its application. And even for merely just for pragmatic purposes in the world, we need to learn how to tolerate and deal with people with whom we may disagree at a fundamental level. So that's all very true. But tolerance is finally an unstable virtue. Tolerance can be a satellite virtue or a subsidiary virtue to truth. But everything finally comes down to an understanding of truth in a holistic sense, what a human being is, what the purpose and destiny of a human being is. These things are always at work in our political and moral categories, whether we know it or not. And tolerance is not an exception. So tolerance risks becoming the tail that wags the dog of truth. Tolerance risks becoming the new truth. And you could say that's in a way the dogmatic fanaticism of wokeness, as if a diversity of truth could be the truth, but it can't. It's a rapacious solvent of any livable truth, I would say. But people embrace it fanatically as if it's a truth.
So Ralph, speaking of tolerance and allowing certain things to happen, so to speak, here at BYU, I want to get back to that. Just this week, there was a talk given by a professor that I have brought up before on the podcast that had to do with it's interesting at BYU because at a minimum, I can say they remove the term equity. And so you don't see things that say diversity, equity, and inclusion, because equity is the end goal to this. But they do call it diversity and inclusion. So this is a diversity and inclusion talk from a professor. And I know that you've got some knowledge of this talk.
Yeah, this happened just yesterday. And yeah, by the way, it is interesting. I guess equity is the edgiest part or the most flagrantly radical part of diversity.
It's the most anti-gospel part.
Yeah, but diversity and inclusion seem like concepts that we can just incorporate within a gospel framework. That's why I think they're all the more insidious for that reason, the way they tend to be understood in the contemporary intellectual and academic environment, including at BYU. Well, this is not just a happenstance lecture, somebody who happened to be visiting the university. No, it was a BYU faculty member honored to give a named lecture, the Martin Hickman lecture of my college, Family, Home, and Social Sciences. And by the way, Martin Hickman was a friend or a senior colleague of mine who, died on the job at BYU actually some decades ago. I don't think Professor Hickman, Brother Hickman, eventually Dean Hickman of our college for a time would necessarily appreciate this honoree for his named award. But this talk, this officially sponsored diversity and inclusion talk used all the language of authenticity, of being who you are, of being accepted just as you are. So these are the terms of inclusion. And this is absolutely incompatible with the identity ideas that President Nelson laid down. When did he begin laying them down? Was it last April or?
I think it was the year before.
Or the year before. Our identity as sons and daughters of God, as disciples of Christ,
and children of the covenant.
Children of the covenant. There was nothing about that, or at least that was not the emphasis. The emphasis was on including diversity of all kinds and accepting people as they are and not putting up barriers. You see, this is the constant temptation when we think about inclusiveness. Then we think of any substance, any moral and spiritual content, any explicitly distinctive religious teachings as barriers. So we use religion against religion, Christianity against Christianity. To be truly Christian is to be inclusive, so it's not to be Christian. It's to include people on their own terms, whatever identity they advance or claim or assert. And so this I think was absolutely the language of the speech that we heard yesterday.
And by the way, this is not surprising that in your college that this is who receives this award.
Yeah, I don't think I was a candidate for the award, Greg.
No, I don't think you were, Ralph.
The argument of the honored speaker of the Hickman Diversity and Inclusion Lecture was that fitting in is the greatest barrier to belonging. So the fact that we asked people to conform to certain beliefs and doctrines and standards of character and faithfulness is a barrier to belonging. It's a way of asking people to be like us rather than just embracing their authentic selves. And so the language of the authentic self was used as was sort of inserted into this supposedly Christian ethic of inclusion. This is basically a way of so separating the second great commandment to love neighbor from the first. And here I'm echoing the profoundly important language of Elder Christofferson, which he's repeated on more than one occasion. But this separating of love of neighbor from our love, loyalty, obedience to God, what we get is the validation of the authentic self and its assertion of identities that have nothing to do with our trifold identity as so emphatically defined by President Nelson. And this is, how can we not say this is mainstream at BYU? This is our honored FHSS lecture.
Yes, and that's what people need to realize. It's again, it's kind of like, so who is your college, by the way, also, because your college is usually going to be the culprit on this, but it's, we're bringing in Professor Pagan. Why is this the man that is chosen to speak about the Book of Mormon here? It's because of what he's spoken of already, and they know exactly what he's going to say, and they want that message going out to the students, which is similar to what this professor spoke of yesterday. It's interesting, because Elder Christofferson, speaking of Elder Christofferson, he gave a talk about the doctrine of belonging. It is the exact opposite of the way this professor is using it. It's the exact opposite. And we know very simply that there is a narrow gate and a narrow path that we are supposed to follow. And we are supposed to change and assimilate to that truth and to that path. And yet what the doctrine here that she is teaching of DEI and inclusivity and her version of belonging is we're going to widen the gate and widen the path as much as possible so that every person, regardless of what you choose, is included. And that becomes the goal, and that becomes the end. It is a goal of equity. That is a wide gate, is a goal of equity that says that, everybody receives the same thing and everybody gets the same thing, regardless of the way you choose to live your life.
But notice this transmogrification of the idea of inclusivity. It demonstrates that inclusivity, like tolerance, or even more than tolerance, I would say, is an unstable virtue, because by redefining the gospel in terms of an inclusive love dissociated from any from putting God first, from seeking holiness, from obeying commandments, from keeping covenants, and inclusiveness detached from that becomes a new, like a counter dogmatism, a new definition of the religion. And who's now excluded? Anyone who says, like, what about the commandment thing?
Yeah.
What about putting God first? What about inviting people to enter in upon the straight and narrow path to baptism and covenants and all the steps of obedience that lead to exaltation? What about that? That's what's excluded in this sort of reversed inclusiveness.
Yeah, belonging seems to be more a destination of liberation.
Yeah, well, exactly. Belonging and inclusivity cash out as liberation, as the liberation of the authentic self. Exactly. And then all the passions of wokeness attach themselves to that liberation because it's an incoherent and bottomless idea. Human beings are not meant to be liberated from all moral and religious norms or all definitions of what makes a good person. So it really opens up this vacuum, or this whirlpool of passion that is never satisfied, and that is always like scapegoating those who stand for judgmentalism because they actually stand for something, etc. But don't get me started. Now I'm into the psychology of wokeness.
Well, it just seems to me that the authentic self is natural man. That's all it is.
Yeah. At its worst.
Yeah, at its worst. Yeah.
Not just a natural man who has his sort of bodily appetites, which tend to be insatiable, but the natural man as overcome by this devouring psychological need to assert a new identity, to assert whatever identity clamors for validation, and to respond hatefully to any remaining stance of judgment.
Yeah. Well, Ralph, really appreciate your words. Always enjoy you coming on the show. I want to give a shout out to the curriculum that you are the source of, which is Fathom the Good. You can find this at fathomthegood.com. It is based on the founding principles of liberal democracy, liberalism found in the founding of America. And they've got curriculum both for high school and for adults. And I think you guys need to go and check this out and see if it's something that you should include in your understanding of what's going on in the world today, of wokeism and these mists of darkness that are put out there. This is some clarity, some much needed clarity that you can learn from.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Fathom the good. That's what we've been talking about. The question of the good of moral substance doesn't go away, and it can't be replaced by this neutral fairness or a tolerance without content or inclusiveness. The question of the good of the human person and of the good community, these questions don't go away. That insight is really the foundation, or you might say the keynote that keeps coming back of this curriculum.
Great, Ralph. Thanks so much. We'll put the links to your article on political neutrality in the description box, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you, Greg.